Okay, we're back for part 2 of what I'm calling the Bugman's view of fascism, and we're at the bottom of page 4 of this first chapter of A. James Gregor's book, The Search for Neofascism. Together with a host of moralizers who collected around the interpretation of fascism as the product of moral decay were the Marxists and sometimes Marxists, who, before, during, and after the war, argued that generic fascism was the predictable product of a universal, quote-unquote, class struggle of, quote-unquote, proletarians against oppressive capitalism. Fascism, in whatever form, was understood to be an excrescence of industrial and/or financial capitalism, a weapon in capitalism's reactionary struggle against the advent of a liberating proletarian revolution. So when he says Marxists and sometimes Marxists, he's talking about the pinkos, the liberals, basically, in America, like what we talked about, the people who were running the FDR administration. They might not be active Marxists themselves, but they're definitely leaning in that direction, and they're quite often called liberals. So there are real liberals out there, but they're pretty rare. Quite a lot of people, at least until recently, used to hide under the umbrella of liberalism because they were too scared or too crafty to just call themselves Marxists or communists outright. So what he's giving us here is the Marxist theory of the emergence and function of fascism, which is that it's a reactionary anti-communist response. Which maybe there's something to that, right? Based on the theoretical Marxism of the 19th century, committed scholarship left little room for any alternative interpretation. The role of fascism was understood to be the domestication of workers' organizations in the service of monopoly capitalism. Since capitalism, to sustain its profitability, must restrict its labor costs and increase prices, the most propitious environment would be one in which the nation is at war. Price controls restrict the movement of wages, and the escalating demand for products inflates prices. Since the wartime demand for products is critical to the nation's very survival, quote-unquote, big business receives whatever it demands from the government for its output. Now we're talking about fascism here. So this is Italy and Germany in World War II in the 30s. But to me, that paragraph really describes America in the 1930s and during World War II, in which the fusion between the big business interests, the top level of business, and the federal government was basically complete. The FDR administration, and also in World War I this happened too, but to a lesser extent, I think. Bernard Baruch in World War I, we talked about him, his background. He was put in charge of the War Production Board, paid something like $1 a year for his salary, and then he, being one of these financiers and industrialists, and banker to industrialists, he goes out to all these people who own these big companies and coordinates with them through the government. So they all get rich through government contracts, and then in World War II, famously, people like John Kenneth Galbraith, who we're going to talk about in the future, were responsible for putting in place price controls. So wages and prices get set at a certain level. However, the business, they get so-called cost-plus contracts. Anyhow, it's impossible to get into. But to me, this paragraph really sounds more like America, actually, which was the most anti-fascist country that ever existed, right? In such circumstances, fascism, in the service of its masters, is required to keep the nation either in conflict or on a war footing. The unrelenting drive to involve Italy in war had to be understood as an irrepressible and inextricable feature of Mussolini's rule. Fascism's military adventures in Ethiopia, Spain, and the Balkans, concluding with Italy's catastrophic involvement in the Second World War, were simply the necessary consequence of Mussolini's subservience to his master's interests. So again, this is the Marxist interpretation of fascism. Mussolini's working for big business and high capital. While distinctive in its own right, the Marxist interpretation, which rapidly became an interpretation of generic fascism, so this same theory is applied particularly to Hitler's Germany, for instance. If you go back and you read some of the primary literature, what these Marxists were saying about Hitler and National Socialism in the early 30s, they were saying he was a pawn of big business, so they're following this explanation rather. This interpretation of generic fascism enjoyed an easy compatibility with the moral assessment that colored prevailing judgments. Capitalists were oppressors and exploiters, and fascists were their janissaries. Janissaries, as you may or may not know, were a class of permanent mercenaries almost, if that makes sense. Christian boys were bought, recruited, or stolen from Christian villages in the Balkans, converted to Islam, and then pampered in Constantinople and created into a class of high IQ, highly loyal, and somewhat isolated soldiers for the Ottoman Empire. And so they were more reliable than levy troops or conscripts because their fortunes rose and fell with the empire, but they ended up being a Praetorian Guard that would do coups on the Sultan. So anyhow, what he's trying to say here is that the fascists were supposed to be this loyal body of troops to defend the capitalists. The proletariat was the savior of freedom and fulfillment. The fascists were their sworn adversaries. Fascists represented the immoral and reactionary quote-unquote right, while the quote-unquote left embodied all the virtues of the European Enlightenment. So progress, technological and social, is supposed to be something coming out of the French Revolution all the way back to the Renaissance. So it's the denigration of Christian religion, local and national culture, and the substitution of those things with technological ascendancy and dictatorship of the least capable and the least able, right? Fascists of whatever provenance were of the right because they were the hewers of wood and drawers of water for quote-unquote finance capitalists. Since industrial capitalism could no longer sustain itself, given the quote-unquote laws of capitalism outlined in the work of Karl Marx, the leaders of industry were compelled to seek recourse outside the traditional liberal democratic system in which they had found their origin and which they had originally prospered. So according to the Marxist theory, history and society move forward and change mechanistically. There's no way around it. It's going to happen. And so the capitalists, in order to prolong their position, have to bring about fascism, because otherwise there would be a workers' revolution and that would be the end of the capitalist system. So this is just fascism, according to the Marxists, is an attempt by these people to prolong their privileged position. The fascists were funded, organized, and elevated to power in order to create the conditions for economic survival in circumstances of declining rates of profit, made inevitable, according to Marx, by the very conditions of advanced industrialization. And I'd say they're kind of correct here, and also very wrong, because I think profits were actually increasing in this time period. So some in the 1900s and 19 teens, I think profits were actually going up for these people. But at the same time, I know for a fact from reading some of the diaries that Hitler was financed by capitalists, because they viewed him as a way to make sure that Bolshevism would not enter Germany, and therefore they wouldn't be expropriated. So I'm not so sure. I guess the Marxists are just flat wrong about an indigenous workers' revolt happening in Germany on its own, bubbling up naturally from the proletariat. Communism is really always an international criminal conspiracy. So it's a contagion and it's a plague rather than a natural process, like you've got a pot of water boiling on the stove and you have the lid on, and eventually the lid gets knocked off and the water sprays out everywhere. That's not how communism works. It's actually a disease that's carried from one area to another through certain persons who are the carriers of that disease, certain individuals and groups. Let's see here. This interpretation, which quickly became identified with Joseph Stalin, became standard for Marxist-Leninists in general and adherents of the Third International. In particular, it made all and any quote-unquote fascism a quote-unquote right-wing extremism. So he's saying that this goes back to Stalin, actually, is the origin of this. I don't know about that. I guess he knows better than me. I would have thought that that would be a Anglo-British interpretation. But hey, maybe they got it from Stalin, right? In the 20s, I don't know. Defined as any movement or regime committed to the defense of capitalism. So any movement or regime committed to the defense of capitalism is fascist and right-wing extremist, at the price of interminable involvement in bloodshed and organized violence. So fascism is going to put the late capitalist society on a course for civil war, basically, or street fighting at a minimum, because the fascists with their capitalist masters are going to start fights to try to stop the inevitable workers' revolution. Those Marxists independent of the Third International very early took exception to the quote-unquote standard version. They argued that Italian fascism gave every indication of being an autonomous, mass-mobilizing movement that arose in social and economic circumstances in which the established elites found it impossible to rule effectively. You might, well, we won't talk about that. Whatever else fascism did, it arrogated to itself political power, and if capitalists, finance or industrial, profited as a consequence, it was largely because their profit served the political interests of Mussolini and his entourage. So the dissident Marxists, maybe the Trotskyists, the people who are outside the official Stalin clique, dissident Marxists, they're viewing fascism as more natural and independent, and to the extent that the interests of the fascists overlap with the business people and the capitalists, it's kind of incidental, and it would just be like petty bribery and things. It's not a social force. Some independent Marxists went further. Fascism's quote-unquote task was seen as the, quote, further development of the productive forces, end quote, of the peninsula, so that's Italy. Fascism was seen as having, quote, systematically spurred, end quote, development in heavy industry, in its chemical, automotive, aircraft, and maritime branches. Otto Bauer, Franz Borkenau, Arthur Rosenberg, and August Thalheimer, as independent Marxists, were prepared to acknowledge the developmental intentions of fascism. So these guys are saying, if you look at what Mussolini and his people have done in Italy, They have built up the Italian industrial capacity to a significant degree in these targeted major industries that they've identified. And so their appreciation of this is something that not a lot of people are willing to talk about, because they want to do the Bugman thing and they want to talk about, oh my God, fascism's about hating everybody, National Socialism's about hating everybody, it's about starting wars with people, it's about putting Jews in gas chambers, it's about expelling people from your country, this, that, and the other, whereas one of the primary motives of this stuff was to build up industrial capacity in places where it wasn't before. So that was one of the primary motivations of both Hitler and Mussolini, was to build up strategic industries that they'd outlined. And Italy was kind of crippled by the fact that it didn't have any natural resources hardly, but they did what they could, I guess. However much capitalism may have benefited, fascism's purposes were quote-unquote progressive. Note that. Fascism was hardly the creature of finance or industrial capitalism. Whatever benefits Italian capitalism may have enjoyed were purchased by submission to the totalitarian rule of Mussolini. So the capitalists in fascism don't get expropriated, they don't get thrown into the gulag, but they're also not brought into government. So they're going to stay over there, they're going to make a certain amount of money, but they're damn well going to do what they're told. And if Mussolini or whatever, whoever it happens to be, tells them that they're going to have to build, some kind of shipbuilding facility in Ostia, in the port there, then they're going to have to do it whether it's profitable or not. They just have to do it. And so the fact that the government takes on long-term planning will improve the economy necessarily over the short-term the short-term interest that we always associate with capitalism. But then the question is, are these guys able to choose good long-term goals? So it's sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't, and it may just depend on people's personalities. South Korea is a great example, where they were in Japan also, where they were the government was guiding industries in a certain direction. They made smart choices and it worked out great for everybody. In America, it's the other way around, of course, where the corporations are guiding the government. So it's one way or the other, I guess. The opening of Italian archives after the war revealed no evidence of a conspiracy between the quote-unquote magnates of industry and Mussolini's fascism. In fact, there's ample evidence of a mounting resistance to fascist rule by the leaders of industry throughout the 20 years of its tenure. Fascism had gradually assumed control over fundamental aspects of the overall Italian economy. By the mid-1930s, most of the critically important functions of enterprise had been surrendered to fascist control. The availability of credit was largely determined by members of the fascist elite. The peculiar development of domestic manufacturing was largely controlled by the fascist government through the corporative agencies fabricated by those around Mussolini. So, what do we need to talk about here? Okay, so the Marxist thesis, the standard Marxist thesis, the Stalinist thesis, he says was proved wrong because after the war they looked at the archives and there was no evidence for government takeover, conspiracy, collaboration between the big businessmen and the fascists. And it's pretty simple to understand why that would be the case. You think if you own, let's say you own a big telecommunications company today, do you want a dictator in power who may, for instance, tell you to stop censoring people on the internet who say things that you don't like in something that you basically have a monopoly in, let's say? Let's say you're an internet telecommunications company, and you own the only real video video sharing website on the internet, and you start censoring certain political opinions, right? Would you rather have a really fractured liberal democracy with a whole bunch of corrupt politicians that you could, for instance, bribe? Or would you rather have a dictator who survives not on the basis of votes, but by popular support, and who will have a coup against him if he's not popular enough? So I think it's pretty obvious as to why they didn't find any evidence of conspiracy. In Germany, of course, the issue was that Hitler was supported by the industrialists because they were extremely scared of Bolshevism and thought it was possible that it would come to Germany. But that's a whole other issue. After the termination of the Second World War, Italian economists affirm that, quote, after 1936, the fascist government controlled proportionately a larger share of Italy's industrial base than any other nation in Europe, other than the Soviet Union, end quote. So it was really, very, very heavy government involvement, which naturally precludes the finance capitalist and the business capitalist, right? Because it's the government clique that's running everything. Equally clear is the fact that the business community in general welcomed the disappearance of fascism. Fascism never served the interests of Italian business. As will be argued, fascism had made its revolution with the rapid expansion and technological development of Italian industry as one of its programmatic goals, because they're progressive, they're materialist of a sort. If you read The Doctrine of Fascism by Gentile and Mussolini, it is effectively materialist but articulated spiritually through the destiny of the nation. So it's not totally materialist, but they follow materialist goals to quite a large extent. So that's why there's this emphasis on industrial development and technology. As a consequence, the Italian entrepreneurial class did benefit, but at the cost of its independence. So you might have money, but you don't have decision-making power. Curiously enough, beginning in the decade of the 1960s, particularly outside of the intellectual environment of the advanced industrial democracies, the interpretation of fascism as a tool of quote-unquote capitalism in general, or quote-unquote finance capitalism in particular, gradually receded. In the Soviet Union, the formal Stalinist interpretation of the interwar years gradually gave way to a much more nuanced account that saw Italian fascism, as distinct from Hitler's National Socialism, a multi-class response to late industrial development. So after the war, when the USSR isn't really threatened anymore, it's basically got hegemony over half of the earth, they soften because, they never really fought the Italians. There would have been engagements where Italian soldiers were killed and did kill and were killed by Soviet soldiers, but those were pretty limited. And so, and I don't think they ever had a really huge propaganda campaign against Italy itself. They were too worried about the Germans. So they're becoming, just a bit more open, a bit more realistic about some of these ideas. While still a quote-unquote class phenomenon, Italian fascism was beginning to be understood as a far more complex and functional response to a set of socio-economic conditions than Marxist-Leninists had previously considered. By that time, it had become increasingly difficult to understand. Now, this is critical, okay? This is where we're really getting into some important stuff here. By that time, it had become increasingly difficult to understand why fascism represented a quote-unquote right-wing political response to issues. So this is what we're always arguing about, guys. Always, always, always. It creates so many problems. We just never get over it. What's right-wing and what's left-wing? And I do have a little thing that I'm working on that I showed to one person already. But it's basically like, you have to define the axes of politics, and then that determines whether it's right or left. So if you're talking about economic stuff, like state involvement in the economy, state ownership or state control of the economy, well then fascism's left wing, because like he said on the previous page, the Italian fascist government controlled proportionally a larger share of the economy than any other European country, and that it was closest to the Soviet Union with regards to that. So if the Soviet Union under Stalin is left wing, which I would say that it is, with some sort of, with some nationalist aberrations due to pragmatic concerns on Stalin's part, like getting rid of free access to abortion and reinstituting family life, and during the war allowing some Christian churches to function, all those aberrations, it's essentially a left-wing government. But as long as we're talking about economics, it seems like you would have to define fascism as left-wing. But if you start bringing in all the other components, society, culture, nationalism, all that, well then it gets pushed back towards the center from where we had it on the left in terms of the economics, and maybe it gets pushed over into the right wing. I don't know. But as long as you and the other person that you're talking to can define what you mean by left wing and right wing, you won't have a problem. But when I show up and I've got my conception or my pet definition, and you have yours, and I say left and you say left, and we both nod, yeah, okay, I know what you're talking about, we've got completely different ideas in our head. So this is a source of endless confusion, unfortunately. But I like the way he's dealing with it here, because he's simply raising the question of, well, this doesn't add up, and it's stimulating to think about it. Fascism, was certainly not the white guard of capitalism. In the late 1920s, fascism had declared private property rights and private initiative to be contingent on their service to the state. So fascism doesn't even have private property as a sacrosanct virtue, whereas I'm pretty sure from reading the National Socialist primary stuff that they did. I think Hitler repeatedly says we don't want to abolish private property. Double check me on that, but I'm pretty sure, whereas the fascists by comparison are coming right out and saying, you don't have a right to use property against your nation, right? So let's say that you own a business, you own a building, and you own a building and a printing press. You don't have a right to print pornography there. You just don't. If it's antisocial, you don't have a right to do it. And so maybe the government just comes and confiscates your building and your printing press rather than telling you that you can't use it for that purpose. Maybe they just take it. By the mid-1930s, foreign observers could maintain that, quote, the fascist corporative system has been and is likely to continue to be not an agency for the economic self-government of the Italian people, but an instrument of economic control used by the totalitarian fascist state for the achievement of its ultimate economic and political ends. Why any of that made fascism right-wing, quote-unquote, is difficult to understand. That it was not a democracy seems clear, but not all anti-democratic politics or polities, not all anti-democratic polities, like the Soviet Union, for instance, are right-wing, right? Right-wing anti-democratic politics, left-wing anti-democratic politics. Furthermore, there is no credible evidence that fascism controlled the nation's economy for the benefit of the quote-unquote possessing classes. All the evidence notwithstanding, for decades after the end of the Second World War, fascism continued to be identified with the interests of capitalism and private enterprise at the expense of the quote-unquote common man. Many academics in the West were convinced that only quote-unquote left-wing arrangements could provide succorance to the needy and the oppressed. And so in America, if you look at the propaganda, and I didn't realize how deep this went until I read this chapter, but all of this stuff that was being printed in the 1930s in America against fascism and National Socialism takes this line. So popular literature and academic stuff, it was all basically Stalinist, right? And you'll just encounter this over and over again, repeatedly arguing that the fascists are the tools of the financiers, which in America is absolutely ridiculous, because the financiers and the Roosevelt people, were hand in hand the whole time, and they're the ones who are arguing against fascism. So it's very, very dishonest. Page 8. For a time, scholars in the Soviet Union were standard bearers of just that sort of interpretation of the domestic and international political and economic order. Marxism-Leninism was left-wing, and fascism, in all its variants, was right-wing. Many academics in the West simply accepted such a construal of the then contemporary world. So there was one example from the last episode I did where I showed that Eckes, the not Interior Secretary, maybe he was the Interior Secretary in the FDR administration, was just getting his ideas straight from the Communist Party manifesto in the United States, and he's saying that this is working for a lot of other stuff too. I didn't realize this, that it was that bold, that flagrant. I mean, can you imagine if the Republican Party in the 1930s in America was pulling its party platform from Hitler? That's essentially what we're talking about, right? If a bunch of conservative academics were just pulling their arguments straight from Hitler and Mussolini, it's shocking, right? Shocking, the double standard. For years after the war, many in the West imagined Joseph Stalin to be the moral guide for a left-wing, liberating revolution of workers and peasants. Not until after Stalin's death and the revelation of massive violation of citizens' rights and the abuse of minority groups and the mass murder of innocents in the Soviet Union did many of those Western intellectuals who identified human liberation with the Soviet Union think better of their position. However, we know that a lot of people already knew about all those problems. You can go read about Durante and the Ukrainian famine. So a lot of big people. There was actually a criminal conspiracy of the Soviet Union press guy, like the guy who's supposed to handle all of the foreign press correspondence in the Soviet Union. He actually got a bunch of these foreign journalists in the Soviet Union together and just had them agree to shut up the Ukrainian famine issue. So that's a criminal conspiracy. So the journalists were perfectly willing to cover up murder so as not to hurt themselves financially and protect the reputation of the Soviet Union. So those are the Bugmen of the 1930s, which are no different than the Bugmen of today. Unfortunately, this is a plague on human civilization and Western culture. What else? There was one more issue I wanted to bring up here. Oh yeah, okay. So when a bunch of these people found out that Stalin wasn't what he was cracked up to be, when they finally were forced by the Cold War, which kind of broke the dam and allowed all of this information to come flooding into the West and become publicized, up until about 1947, any negative information about the Soviet Union was actively suppressed by the United States federal government, the U.S. military, the journalistic establishment, the press, the publishing houses. Everyone was actively suppressing negative information about the Soviet Union. They even blamed the Katyn Forest massacre on the Germans, even though if you go read the primary documents, it's a closed case. and you've really got to be a sick person, like Grover Furr. I think you have to be a pretty sick person to go and try to argue that the Germans did this. But anyhow, when all this information finally started flooding into the West after the Cold War started and the U.S. and the Soviets were in public opposition to each other, all these Stalinists had to figure out what they were going to do because they couldn't support the Soviet Union anymore. And so my idea, I think they all just became globalists. They started arguing for world government. That's what the left ones would do. Most of the Jewish ones became neoconservatives or proto-incipient neoconservatives, nascent neoconservatives, and they started the long march through the American right. Of course, they had broken with Stalin before this, but they couldn't really get anywhere with their anti-communism until the Cold War started. So they were in the weeds, or in the wilderness from 1936 or 37 until 1948. But starting in 48 with the anti-communist stuff, they rode on the back of McCarthy and all that stuff and the Cold War to then worm their way into the American right and dominate it, which is where we are today. So anyhow, the Stalinists, there's basically no Stalinism in America. It completely evaporated, and those factions went to globalism and neoconservatism more generally, is what I think happened. Sorry for that long excursus. So we find out that the Soviet Union was a bad deal and Stalin was no good. Quote, or then we start the text again. The Soviet Union under Stalin had begun to look remarkably like Germany under the ministrations of Hitler. The right-wing, left-wing distinction began to become undone. So if Hitler and Stalin aren't that different, then what does that mean for left-wing and right-wing? Hitler was supposed to be this right-wing fascist, right-wing extremist, but what the two groups did was about the same. For many Western intellectuals, one of the consequences of the revelations concerning the Great Terror, the death of millions, and the anti-Semitism of Stalin, which I got Matthew Raphael Johnson's book here. Let me see if I can get it without causing a... Okay. Whew. The Soviet experiment challenging the apologists for communist tyranny. So he'll have a lot of information in here. Okay. He'll have a lot of information in here talking about Stalin's anti-Semitism. And, it's true that Stalin killed a lot of Jews in his government and outside of his government, but he was killing them not because of their Jewishness, but because of their status as old Bolsheviks or threats to him, and he retained many Jews in his government after that. So Stalin's so-called anti-Semitism is really, it really says more about the ethnic origins of the Bolshevik group rather than Stalin's anti-Semitism. He wasn't an anti-Semite. I want to say that all of Stalin's children who got married Jews, so it's kind of like Donald Trump. And some people say Donald Trump's an anti-Semite, and I think that's ridiculous. He's obviously not. Where are we? Okay, the anti-Semitism of Stalin was the abandonment not of the right-wing, left-wing distinction, but of Soviet Marxism as the normative guide to liberation. So what was abandoned was not the left-wing, right-wing dichotomy, but Soviet Marxism. So Marxism's still okay, not Soviet Marxism. Stalinism was forsaken, and some of those self-same intellectuals simply transferred their loyalties to the Marxism-Leninism of Mao Zedong. For a not inconsiderable number, Mao's China assumed the role of a leftist vanguard of human liberation. And we could find a lot of former Stalinists and Marxists from the West who worked in the American government, and journalists. I wish I could remember the woman's name. She married a guy named Shubin. I can't remember her name for the life of me, but she was an American Stalinist, big author, big journalist in her day, and she died in Beijing because she broke with the Stalinists and moved to China, moved it right over. So you never stop being a Marxist; you just move over to the other Marxist country. And a bunch of these people like Lachlan Curry, all these other disgusting people. I think several of those British spies too, right? Didn't they go to China? Didn't they die over there? So this is a big movement too. This is a big thing that happened. I'm not going to abandon Marxism. You're just going to heap everything on Stalin. And another thing that Matt Johnson talks about in this book is the fact that Marx, Lenin, Trotsky, and Stalin are generally in agreement. Okay, they're generally in agreement. They each make a few minor revisions. The Stalin-Trotsky argument is not so much about theory and politics as it is about who gets to be the guy in charge. And Solzhenitsyn definitely says that, Stalin was just carrying on what Lenin started, and he has a lot of quotes in the Gulag Archipelago showing statements that Lenin made that could just as easily be attributed to Stalin. So there's really no difference. But hey, we're going to go to Mao Zedong now because he hasn't yet killed all those people, or it hasn't yet become public knowledge and made it inconvenient for us. For a not inconsiderable number, Mao's China assumed the role of a leftist vanguard of human liberation. Given the circumstances, even after the abandonment of Stalinism, the interpretation of fascism as an immoral, right-wing, anti-communist tool of reaction continued to maintain a semblance of plausibility. So fascism as an immoral, right-wing, anti-communist tool of reaction. So in this period, it's not completely discredited yet. These people who moved to China are still arguing that. In that intellectual environment, so this is kind of we're now getting into some more modern stuff here, modern thought pattern. In that intellectual environment, any anti-communist effort on the part of individuals, groups, governments, or confederations was interpreted by some to be a sure sign of quote-unquote right-wing fascism. So get that again here. In that intellectual environment, so we're talking about Marxists who are maybe moving away from Stalin, any anti-communist effort on the part of individuals, groups, governments, or confederations was interpreted by some, minority, to be a sure sign of right-wing fascism. So this is where we are today, right? Where whatever you don't like is fascism. It's beginning, I guess, probably we'll say 1950, 1955 is what we're talking about. So anything that's opposed to the left is fascism, regardless of what it is. This is a discontinuity. This is a break with the past, because here it's not specifically related to economics or politics. It's just anything opposed to communism. So monarchism, libertarianism, liberal democracy, as long as it's legitimate liberal democracy and not just a front for another Marxist system, all that's right-wing fascism. Okay, we're coming up on 45 minutes, so we're going to stop here. This is taking an exceptionally long time to get through, but I'm enjoying reading this out loud and thinking my way through it. I've already read the article a couple of times, but I'm enjoying reading it again with you. I hope it's helpful. I'm going to try to attach some of the music to the beginning and the end to the video rather than having it play throughout. Had that helpful comment from somebody. Thank you all for your continued support. Thank you for your helpful and insightful comments. I'll talk to you soon.